Your Honor, opposing counsel, members of the jury. Malice, misrepresentation, and murder. You've heard the presence of all three of those things today, and the defendant is guilty of all three of those things. The defendant became enraged after seeing his daughter with an unknown older man and hacked into his daughter's social media accounts. It was then he found out that the man she was with was Stephen Walker, and it was then that the defendant decided to kill Stephen Walker. Malice. So he looked up directions to the victim's home, like many of us do, using Google. He found his way there. He walked in, shot him 3 times, and walked out. After returning home, he told you, me, and everyone else that he blacked out for 8 days. But if you listen, he has told 3 different people 3 different stories about when that blackout began. Misrepresentation. The defendant wanted Stephen Walker dead, and the defendant lied about what he was doing when Stephen Walker died. It all adds up to murder. The story is that simple, and it is that story that is consistent with the evidence. You know that because Dusty Stockard took the stand and told you the facts. How she came upon the scene, finding Stephen Walker's body with 3 fatal gunshot wounds. More than enough to finish the job because this was personal for John Draft. She told you about how she found these messages. The same ones that the defendant told you made him ill. The ones that sent him into a violent rage. She also told you about the bullet casings. She found a .32 caliber at the scene. She found a .32 caliber in the defendant's pocket. She also told you how the defendant began speaking nonsense, but only after Stockard told him that she was standing over the lifeless body of his victim. Probably because insanity seemed like the only way out. Ladies and gentlemen, Dusty Stockard saw firsthand the defendant's malice, the defendant's misrepresentation, and the defendant's murder. You then heard from Dr. Chris Ciccone. You heard how he used his education he gained at Lone Star State, Lone Star Medical School, and residency at Johns Hopkins. He reviewed all the exhibits, all the testimony, and the charts. He came to his conclusion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty that John Draft does not suffer from a mental disease or defect and has never suffered from a mental disease or defect. If you had listened to Dr. Ciccone's testimony, you could have made your own conclusions. That the defendant is lying. He told you that he blacked out as soon as he saw those messages. He told Dr. Ciccone he can't remember anything after going to the victim's house after seeing those messages. Next you heard from Dr. Chris Johnson. Dr. Johnson told you about all the time she spent getting paid to talk to the defendant. Dr. Johnson told you about the tests she ran on the defendant. She also told you how she failed to follow the simple guidelines that she set forth in her own treatise. She manually scored her client's exam. She wasn't about to let her client's results be left up to the impartiality of a machine, so she scored them herself, despite telling her peers not to do so. Finally, you also heard from the defendant himself. He told you his stories he remembers. That upon seeing his daughter with an older man, he became so worked up that he blacked out for 8 days. But he's also told you another story. He hasn't fired a gun in 5 years. He told you that twice. But then you have to ask yourself, ladies and gentlemen, why would a bullet casing be found on the defendant's person if he hadn't fired a gun in 5 years? It's simple that the defendant had a weapon capable of inflicting the wounds that were found on the victim. He was found with bullet casings matching or of the same type and kind as the ammunition found at the scene. And he's told all different people, all different stories about what he was doing when Stephen Walker died. He had malice. He's misrepresented the truth. And it all adds up to murder.
In Salem,